Speaker, Dr. Dov Sax, is from Brown University. He's an associate professor of ecology and evolutionary biology. I found out tonight that he is also the recent International Biogeography Society president. And tonight his talk is focusing on identifying species at risk from climate change and considering alternate conservation strategies. Please welcome Dr. Dov Sax. Dov Sax, excuse me.
It's okay. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming. So I'm going to give you an overview of some of my work, work with collaborators, but also kind of an overview of some of the issues around climate change and these alternative conservation strategies and how we deal with this big puzzle of trying to figure out which species are at risk. I'll just warn you in advance, definitely don't have it figured out. So if you're looking for that punchline, you're in trouble. But anyway, hopefully there'll be some interesting stuff here. It's refreshing to have students in the audience. That makes me feel comfortable. I can get into my teaching role. And I often ask students in my conservation biology class, where was this photo taken? And they see the puncha in the background, the cactus, and they see the grass, and then they see the star too. I think that sort of throws them, and they immediately think Arizona or something like that. And of course, this is Cape Cod. And the point there, of course, is that microhabitats matter and small areas matter, and that climate is, in the way it manifests and affects species, interacts with things like soil and can be quite complicated and interesting. So I'll jump into the talk. There was a paper that came out more than a dozen years ago now that really got the community thinking about climate change and species extinction. The paper suggested that 15 to 37% of species globally were committed to extinction by 2050. No one believes these numbers. That's the first thing I would say to you. The second thing I would say is that the methods, the way they reach these conclusions, were based off species distribution models. And I just want to, not all of you are like, many of you are very familiar with species distribution models, but some of you aren't. So just to sort of describe what they are, basically the way you build these models is you tabulate the climatic conditions where a species occurs, and you tabulate the conditions where it doesn't occur, and then you estimate the total range of climatic conditions a species can tolerate. So they often used to get called climate envelope models. It's like, what's the envelope of conditions that you can tolerate? And then what they used to do was, they used to say, okay, imagine we have this range, this gray box down here. This is where, imagine this is geographic space. So let's say that this is New England and this is a little bit further north into Maine and parts of Canada. And what they'd say is if the species is here now, and in the future when it's warmer, we expect this to be the suitable area, and there's an overlap at all, then we'd say that's at fairly low risk of extinction. On the other hand, if there was no overlap between the current range and the projected future range, we'd say, okay, there might be a higher risk of extinction. So all of this is to say, and we'll be coming back to species distribution models a lot in this talk, that these numbers are wrong, I think, vastly wrong, but there's a lot of other data since then to suggest that the risk is very real. We don't really have a handle on what the actual percentages are, but seems to be a consensus in the literature right now about 10% being at risk somewhere down the line from climate change. One thing that I've been working on with a colleague is thinking about how climate change interacted to affect extinctions during the Pleistocene, during the last 2.5 million years. And there's actually sort of this conventional wisdom in the literature that there weren't a lot of extinctions during the Pleistocene. But anyway, we're working on a paper that basically says that that's wrong, says that there are a lot of extinctions, and then just documents them by looking through the accounts in the literature. And one thing that jumps out is, this is the most confusing thing. But one thing that jumps out is that when new climatic regimes start up, that's trouble for a lot of species. When there are barriers to dispersal, that's trouble for a lot of species. And of course, when habitat's completely lost. And so if we look in the Pleistocene, where we saw major extinction events and with what groups, one example is with the trees. So Europe lost something like half its genera of trees during the Pleistocene. And in contrast, North America didn't lose any. And one of the difference is that in North America, there aren't a lot of barriers. When things cool down, you can move into the subtropics. But if you're in Europe and you want to move into the subtropics, you've got the problem of the Mediterranean in the way. And you also have all these mountain ranges that sort of bad luck tend to run east-west that block movement. So lots of extinctions there, and the extinctions are caused by this interaction of climate change and barriers to dispersal. Another place that we have a lot of extinctions in the Pleistocene is actually in the western United States, and it's fishes that drop out, freshwater fishes. And it's hard to imagine, this is a picture of Death Valley today, or 20 years ago whenever I took the photo, but it's a very dry place. There's only a few native pupfish there now, but you know, if you go back 15,000 years, this was a big lake, right? And there were pine trees growing not too high above sea level. It was a very different environment, and you know, what the Salt Lake is now in Utah, the Great Salt Lake, is a remnant of a lake system that was as extensive as the Great Lakes in the Midwest. It's just hard to imagine them not being there, and imagine the fish that dropped out. Anyway, lots and lots of documented extinctions. So if you take away the whole habitat, things are going to drop out. So if we go forward now, and we start thinking about the sort of climate change we might have over the next few hundred years, we can think about things like where I'm from in Los Angeles. You know, that's a giant barrier to species movement, right? So if you're some cool little lizard that lives along the coast in Southern California, and all you need to do is move to Northern California, the only problem is this is in the way, right? And of course, this is a common thing. But more important in these urban areas are agricultural regions. Like the Midwest is just a giant wall for a lot of species. Some species move through cornfields and soybean fields without any trouble, but lots of them don't. So it's basically more like a filter. Some species will shift through that landscape and some won't. And then, of course, with climate change, you know, if you're on the top of Mount Washington or the top of any mountaintop, you know, there might not be any reasonable way to get to the next mountaintop that's further north. And of course, if you're on some little isolated island, well, it might be hard to move. And of course, if it's a low-lying island like this, then it will actually get gobbled up by sea level rise. So there's lots of reasons to think about different sorts of extinction risks. But climate change and individual species extinctions aren't necessarily going to happen. And the relationship between climate and species distributions is complex. And not all species move in lockstep with changes in climate. Just because things warm up doesn't mean that a species needs to move. It might be perfectly happy where it is. So this is one of my favorite this is literally a textbook example from a biogeography textbook. So the red dot is a fossil locality from the late Pleistocene where two mammals co-occurred, right? So one of those mammals is this Mexican spiny pocket mouse that used to be in the lowlands of central Mexico and is still in the lowlands of central Mexico, right? One of them is the masked shrew, which is nowhere near the lowlands of central Mexico anymore. So what's happened over the last 20,000 years as things warmed up is one species stayed put. One species shifted, you know, a few thousand kilometers north. That is the crux of the problem in figuring out which species are at risk from climate change. Right now, when we look at any plant you might like, now some plants we know a lot about because people study the heck out of them, but most plants have not been studied intensively. And we don't know if they're the Mexican spiny pocket mouse or they're the masked shrew. Do they need to move or can they stay put? So I say the current status of the field is that many species are at risk from climate change, but we don't know which ones, not with certainty. And we definitely don't agree about what strategies to employ or when to employ them. So in the talk today, I'm going to kind of go through four things, all pretty quickly. One is dealing with conservation strategies. Then I'm going to move on to non-native distributions as a tool for climate research. Then I'm going to talk about niches in climate change, and finally, very briefly, considerations for the New England flora. So I'm going to talk about 7 strategies now. At the end of the talk, I'm going to bring up an 8th strategy. Anyway, so I'm going to go through these strategies. We can kind of break them into the classic conservation strategies, recently established strategies, and sort of controversial new strategies. So the one thing I would say is there's no silver bullet approach. There's no one thing that is going to solve all our problems, and each approach we might take has its own shortcomings. So, you know, protected areas, reserves, national parks, whatever you want to call them, conservation areas, it is a classic approach in the United States, and people talk about putting a fence around it. It's extremely useful. We need to continue to do it. It should continue to be a cornerstone activity of conservation, but it's not sufficient in the context of climate change. I mean, when we think about the climate in Massachusetts, by 2100 it may be more like the climate of North Carolina. And in that context, there's a lot of species that won't, many species that are here will still be fine, but some will not be able to survive here. And so simply putting a fence around it, simply having national parks, won't be sufficient for protecting all species. So another classic conservation approach is what's called ex situ conservation, just means off-site conservation. So placing species in zoos and botanical gardens, it's extremely useful. It has a bunch of its own limitations, right? So these are a few of them. These are like the textbook descriptions. It can be expensive. You worry about population size. You know, if you have 5 elephants, you're not preserving the genetic diversity of elephants, right? Same thing if you have 5 sequoia trees or something like that. So adaptation to captive conditions, this is probably a larger concern with some mammals. Learned skills, this is a big deal with like predators, for instance, that are in zoos. Genetic variability, we could have a limited portion of the gene pool. This is different, I guess, than the population size. We're worried about something called genetic drift. Then there's the continuity. You need a continuous supply of funds to keep these things going. So if there's a war, or a recession or a depression or something, and funding drops away, then that can be a problem. And then the other issue is, and people have figured out ways to avoid this now for the most part, but you certainly wouldn't want to have all your eggs in one basket. There are cases where, you know, one population is preserved in one place and some disease agent moves through and wipes it out, right? So there's those sorts of risks. But anyway, ex situ conservation is valuable. Some of the newer areas that people have been talking about for decades now are connecting protected areas with corridors. Very useful and important approach, but there's several limitations, right? So one limitation is that it won't work for all areas. You can't put a corridor through LA. And the reason you can't put a corridor through LA is we go bankrupt trying to buy the land to actually put an effective corridor. Imagine that there's probably lots of species that if you wanted to put a corridor that was, say, 40 miles long by half a mile wide, I don't know how many trillions of dollars that would cost in Los Angeles, but it would be very expensive. The other issue is the velocity of climate change. We expect to have situations where climate change will be happening at a faster pace than some species are able to disperse. So, I mean, you can think about, I don't know, the most extreme example, something like an earthworm, right? So like earthworm, you know, we think about earthworms since the end of the last glacial maximum 20,000 years ago, they did not manage to colonize the far north. Like the glaciers pushed them down and they did not get back. They're slow dispersers. That's extreme, but you can think about lots of plants that maybe aren't bird dispersed, for instance, that are going to have a hard time moving north quickly. Another issue is just gaps in the climate path. And so I'll give you an example. Imagine that there's a corridor, it's sitting there, and the species can move quickly enough, but it still can't get there if there's a high velocity of climate change and that change is not happening in a continuous way. Let me give you kind of an example of what I mean by these gaps in the climate path. So we can think about, you know, where a species is now, where it's supposed to be in 2020, in 2030, 2040, 2050, and so on. And one thing you can do, and I've done this with my colleague Regan Early, is model dispersal, how fast things can move, and their climate tolerance, and try to figure out if there's dynamics that will create gaps in that path. So imagine that this is where we expect it in 2010, this is where we expect it in 2020 and 2030, and 2040 is supposed to be there, and this time in between is never occupied. This space and time don't line up. One of the reasons this might happen is because of decadal variation in climate change. So this is based on one particular climate model, global climate circulation model, looking at climate change for a particular variable, in this case mean annual temperature, for California by decade. And what we see, according to this global circulation model, what's supposed to happen is that we go from the beginning of the century to the end of the century with this very steady warming. Right? The mean annual temperature is supposed to go up. So if the species care about mean annual temperature, if that's what they care about, then they're going to be able to just sort of march northward if there's nothing blocking their path. But imagine that what they care about is mean winter temperature. And imagine we use a different global climate circulation model, still for California, and we get this sort of variation. Where, it's warm, a little bit cooler, a lot cooler, and then a lot warmer. That shift right there ends up being a problem for species. And this is a real thing, and it's not that we know that this is going to happen in 2020. It's that we know that's going to happen sometime in the next 100 years. And the reason we know that is we have all of these sorts of things that cause decadal oscillations. There's something called the Pacific decadal oscillation. You probably, if you live around here, heard about the Atlantic decadal oscillation. There are these swings that happen. So what happens if a species is marching north and it suddenly gets too cold and it can't handle those temperatures? Those populations die. So we can sort of model these sorts of dynamics, and you end up getting situations like this where this sort of gray area here is where the species is known historically. The hatched is where we expect it to be at the end of the century. We don't expect it to be able to get up here because there ends up being a climate gap there, climate path gap. Not because there isn't appropriate habitat, just because the dispersal capacity and the way climate's changing line up to create these gaps. So the fourth strategy is seed banks, and this is super useful. It's sort of an insurance. Let's bank these seeds, freeze them, store them in some way, and then we've got that genetic material. So it's another super useful approach, but of course it has its own sets of limitations. One is deciding where and how to use seeds in the future. The other is that because climate change is ongoing and not expected to return to a pre-industrial state for thousands of years, this raises the issue of where you're going to put them. It's not like if we hold the seeds and we wait 150 years that we're going to have the temperature and conditions that we have here today again. It's not coming back in the next millennia, at least according to the climate scientists. So here's one of these controversial strategies. It crops up in the literature just maybe 10 years ago now. And it's called managed stasis. Oh, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. I'm going to get to managed relocation. Managed stasis is almost not mentioned in the literature yet. It sort of showed up once or twice. But it's this idea of protecting species in place by modifying the biotic or abiotic conditions of that place. So maybe things are getting hotter, but you plant shade trees to cool a stream. Maybe you irrigate trees experiencing drought stress. Or maybe you exterminate species shifting into the area. So maybe things are moving north, they're going to become competitors, and you weed them out. These would all be examples of trying to create static conditions for the species that's in the place. And this has the same sort of limitations as ex situ conservation. It's expensive, the long-term viability of this approach is questionable, and this can only be done in a very small geographic area. So here's what I meant to say. Managed relocation shows up in the literature about 10 years ago. It gets called, it's a little confusing, it gets all these three words mean the same thing. There are three sets of words. So assisted migration, this idea you're helping things migrate, but migrate in the paleo sense. that's the confusing thing. It's not about annual migrations, but the way paleoecologists talk about migrations, what they mean is what happens over 20,000 years in response to climate change. So you're assisting things to migrate in response to climate. Assisted colonization, that's sort of more intuitive for most English speakers. We're helping it colonize and replace. Managed relocation is the same idea. You're relocating something in a managed, purposeful way. But this strategy aims to reduce negative effects of climate change by moving species to locations where they are likely to persist in the future. So who's doing managed relocation? There's not a lot. It's not very common right now. One example are this interest group called the Trea Guardians. There is endangered conifer, Trea taxifolia, that is found sort of on the border of Georgia and the Florida Panhandle. And this group has decided that because it's doing so poorly, that they'd like to see it move further north. It's not moving further north on its own, and so they have planted it fairly extensively now in Georgia and North Carolina, and they are even trying to plant it in places like New York. So this is a federally listed species. It's a plant. The rules are a little bit different for plants, but because the seed is collected, in this case from a private garden, these estates in North Carolina, it's perfectly legal to do all this. So anyway, this is what they've decided to do. There are scientists doing it. So these scientists in the UK moved a few small butterfly species, and basically they said, well, these things are moving north on their own in response to climate change, but they're still not keeping pace with that velocity of climate change. Let's look at the places that, in theory, they should be able to occur in, because the climate's suitable for them now, but they haven't gotten to yet. And so they did this sort of 10-year experiment where they actually, it's kind of interesting, they moved them, and then they watched them for 10 years, and then they published the results. Sort of said, yeah, they're doing great. The real issues, the big motivations are going to be probably economic for this. So the foresters, of course, are thinking about this. This is a big deal in places like British Columbia, where in some places, some of the trees they plant there, they plant and they plan to harvest 80 years later. So it's an 80-year rotation cycle. So imagine you're going to harvest something 80 years later. You're trying to, and it's a plant that's growing and responding to climate conditions, obviously. You're trying to figure out how you're going to maximize that board feed production. So you want to be sure to plant something you think is going to do well. So there's lots of big experiments to sort of deal with this now, with the forestry industry. It's happening in the US as well, but under the radar. And then there's some examples with marine organisms as well in Australia and other places. And then, of course, I'll get to this in a bit, but I've been working on this topic for a while, and often if I give a talk directly on this, particularly to a big group, there's at least one person that will come up to me afterwards and say, oh yeah, I've got a buddy that's been moving such and such. So this does seem to be happening on a kind of a low level. So anyway, I co-led a working group on this. Those particulars aren't too important, but the idea here that does matter is that we try to get people with different sorts of backgrounds. So academic scientists, but also government scientists that work at the federal agencies and some state agencies. And then this realization that this was not an ecological or botanical problem, that it was an evolutionary problem, climate change, the economics matter, that the law matters, that the ethics matter. And we try to think in an integrated way about these issues. We had a whole bunch of products that came out of this. One of the things that came out was this paper that tried to provide this multidimensional evaluation of the strategy. And there's a lot of, if you're interested in the paper, it was published in 2009, you can look through these categories, but what I want you to see is that we thought of like hundreds of considerations, and we ended up putting them into these 4 categories. But the categories are interesting. So there's focal impact, like what's going to happen to the species that you're interested in if you move it or don't move it. And then there's these collateral impacts. Imagine you move a species somewhere and it does too well and sort of hurts the species. That could be a problem. Or maybe it provides benefits there. So what are those impacts? There's this feasibility of it, and there's the acceptability of it. And a lot of these considerations end up being social and legal. And one member of the group who was a lawyer ended up writing one of these long law articles on this. And basically, he took the point of view that the Endangered Species Act requires the federal agencies to do this. Different environmental lawyers disagree. It'll end up in the courts, of course, somewhere down the line. But the crux of this sort of strategy is that if we move species, they might become invasive, right? So imagine there's a species that's not doing well in, I don't know, in New Jersey, and someone suggests that Massachusetts would be a great spot for it. What if it does too well here and starts damaging our species? But on the other hand, if we don't move species, they might go extinct. So, you know, there's sort of risks either way. So one thing I would argue with the strategy is we'll never be certain about invader impacts, but we can be right most of the time. So there's this giant field of invasion biology, and there are lots to learn from the field. And there are sorts of times where we expect the risks to be really high, and other times with introductions where the risks are probably pretty low. But basically, we're trading off the risk of action and the risk of inaction. The final working group paper, which I would recommend if you're actually just interested in this topic, we wrote it and published it in Bioscience, so it's meant to be intelligible to a general audience, and it sort of deals with the full range of conditions. One of the main conclusions that we had there was really discouraging the use of this strategy right now, saying it might be really useful down the road, but there's a lot we don't know right now, and we have time to figure it out. There's very few species that are at imminent risk of extinction from climate change. I think most of these risks are decades out. Not to say there aren't some now, but so we need to get it right before we start doing these sorts of things. The last one I'll talk about, which is probably the most controversial, but is definitely cropping up in the literature right now in all sorts of different contexts, is managed evolution or assisted evolution. So the different ways you hear about this with examples with corals, you hear about it with terrestrial organisms. So people are interested in taking everything we've learned about the evolutionary machinery and genetics and applying them to some of these species. You know, there are all sorts of potential risks with taking these sorts of actions. Of course, there might be benefits as well. I just want to give you an example of some of the sorts of choices we might face by giving you like a real example species. So this is not to be confused with that Torreya I mentioned before from Florida. This is a pine, the Torrey pine, that has a very limited distribution in California. It's in one spot, one of the Channel Islands, and one spot on the mainland north of San Diego. Its growth is strongly limited by water availability, and we expect Southern California to get a lot drier going forward, as well as hotter. It grows well further north, where it's planted, in places like Santa Barbara and the Bay Area. So one question is, should we relocate this species further north? Should we actually do managed relocation and try to establish populations in the wild? And what we can do is we can ask ourselves, what are the state and federal agencies going to do? What will individuals and activist groups do? And you know, these are kind of some of the options. Establish new populations, or maybe do the managed stasis thing, irrigate and manage existing populations, or we could just preserve them in arboretum gardens. And you know, what's the right thing to do isn't necessarily clear. But what I would say is that these decisions should probably be based on scientific, social, and ethical considerations. And of course, the good news is we do have time to figure this out. Okay, so among the many questions raised by these alternative strategies, I'm particularly intrigued by understanding the extent to which climate limits species distributions. So we're going to jump into this next part of the talk. And Regan Early is one of my main collaborators for this part of the talk. So we just talked about this, how we think about risk and how the models have been applied, right? Are the ranges going to overlap in the future? Are they going to be disjunct in the future? You know, how important is dispersal? All of these models, though, have this assumption that climate limits species distributions. I mean, the species doesn't need to move north if climate isn't important in why it's currently found in the place. Right? So imagine that there's a species that's only in Alabama. Is it not in North Carolina because North Carolina is too cold? If that's true, then as things warm up, it can move into North Carolina. But what if it's some other reason? So how important is climate in limiting species distributions? So if we ask this question, does climate limit species distributions? If the answer is mostly yes, then these species distribution models are going to give us, are going to be accurate and give us important forecasts for the future. If the answer is sometimes climate limits species distribution, then the model performance will be inconsistent. And if the answer is no, like climate's actually not important, either for a group of species or a particular species, then these species distribution models, which are the current state of the art, are useless, right? So it ends up being a really important question. Does climate limit species distributions? And if so, when? And for which species? So one way you can do this is with paleo distributions. They have their own pitfalls because you have to try to project climate back, and you have limited fossil localities and that sort of stuff, but it can be a very useful approach. Another is to take advantage of naturalized distributions. So just by naturalized, I mean, particularly in the case of plants, species that are growing outside their historic range that aren't just able to grow if you plant them, but are actually able to reproduce, and reproduce enough that they can maintain a population. So there have been some comparisons where people have looked at the climate conditions a species occupies in its native range and the climate conditions it occupies in its non-native range. And one of the first studies to do this was Gallagher et al. In 2010. And what they showed was that they looked at 26 plants that were exotic in Australia and compared them with their native climate conditions wherever they were from, and found that there were unexpected occurrences in 20 out of 26 plant species. So a lot of plants were growing in places in Australia they would not have guessed based off their native climate space. This paper came out in Nature, which is a very prestigious journal, in 2012 by Petit-Pierre et al. And they found that approximately 90% match between expected and observed occurrences of Eurasian plants introduced to the US and Australia. They looked at a bunch of plants native to Eurasia. They looked at where they were found in Australia and the US, and they said, look, we can predict 90% of those occurrences based off the climate conditions they experience in their native range in Eurasia. So they concluded, yep, species are limited by climate. And we can use these species distribution models and take them at face value for making predictions. So one important thing, though, about their work was that they didn't pick a random set of species. They picked exclusively species that were weedy and had very large geographical distributions. So when that paper came out, I was already working with my colleague Rican Early on a very similar analysis, and we were finding really different results. So what we did was we had information on plants, native distributions in Europe, and exotic distributions in the US. And we ended up focusing on 51 species that were endemic to Europe or nearly endemic to Europe. So maybe they spilled over a little bit into Asia or Northern Africa. And that we had good data for them in the US. And I'll just give you this example to sort of characterize a couple ideas. So here's a plant native to Europe. The gray is where it is known to occur in the US. And the blue is where we'd expect it to occur based off its distribution in Europe. Right? So if we look at the sort of places, let's say it lives in France, and we look at what the weather is like there, how warm and how cold, and then we say where in the US has similar conditions, right? And we look at all the places in Europe that it occurs and all those conditions, and then we map that onto the US, we get the blue. And then what we can do is look at where the overlap occurs, basically. So one thing we can do is see places like this. So this is a place that the species that's exotic in the US is predicted to be able to occur, but isn't found. That's not too useful for us. Because, yeah, it's supposed to be able to be there, but maybe no one's introduced it there yet. So it's not really sort of falsifying any sort of hypothesis. On the other hand, we have this other type of error, if you like, where here's a place that occurs in the US that we wouldn't have predicted based off the conditions it occupies in Europe. That's what we end up focusing on. Where are the places in the US that it's not supposed to be based off its native distribution in Europe? So one of the things we wanted to know was how much error is typical and are there general rules of thumb? And so what I'm going to show you is a plot here in a second that has the proportion of naturalized localities within the native climate tolerance. So that's basically going to say what fraction of the areas of the naturalized occurrences are where we'd expect. And I'm going to show you the 50 species and I'm going to rank them by the worst to the best sort of predictions, effectively. So this is what we found. So let me walk you through this. So on the x-axis here, this is just a rank order of the species. And the y-axis is this proportion of US distribution that lies within the native climate tolerance. So if it's 100%, if it's a 1 on the y-axis up there, that means these species, those like, I don't know, 7 species, they only showed up places that we would have expected, right? And then, I don't know, these 7 species didn't show up anywhere we would have expected, right? Everywhere they were in the US was someplace we would not have guessed based off their native European distribution. And then each one of these other dots is another species that's somewhere in between. And so one thing I want you to see is the average is, I don't know, 45, 50%. So basically we get it about half right. So now that's a lot of error, right? So there's like a good news, bad news thing here. The good news is that the error isn't random. And I'm not going to try to walk you all the way through these. These figures are actually somewhat complicated. But the gist of it is that the error is highest for species with narrow, native, niche breadth and small geographic distributions. So if there's a species that's only found in northern Italy in the foothills of the Alps, the expectation, the classic expectation is that's because it's a climate specialist for those conditions. What this work says, no, that's not right. Those species, those are the ones that we can't predict where they're going to be. Those are the ones that can handle all sorts of other climate conditions. That means that plant that's only in the foothills of the Alps in northern Italy is actually, we don't know why it's in that small area, but it's not because of climate. It's some other reason. Maybe biotic, maybe interactions with competitors, maybe dispersal limitation, lots of possibilities. So there's some implications of this part of the work. One of the implications is that, so one thing people do now is they'll just look at like 500 species at once and generate a bunch of models and say this is what's going to happen to this part of the flora. So what we would say is that this sort of widespread application of species distribution models to lots of species will lead to lots of errors. Another thing we would say is that native niche breadth is a reasonable proxy for model accuracy. So if you have a species with a gigantic geographic distribution, for whatever reason, that's a species that's good at getting around. It probably is mostly limited by climate, and those boundaries are important in predicting what it can tolerate. But then more work is needed to understand the processes that actually limit species distributions. So now I'm going to jump into the third part of the talk, niches and climate change. So Regan is an important collaborator here, but many of you also know Jesse, and he just gave away an award. But anyway, the three of us have been working on this stuff for several years now. So species distribution models are a powerful approach, but they have lots of limitations. And the limitation we're most interested in is the simplifying assumption that people that use these models normally make. And this is, I'm sorry, this is ecological jargon here. And I'll explain it in a minute though. Is this assumption that the realized niche is equal to the fundamental niche at geographic scales. And what that basically means is the climate conditions that it experiences in the native range, those are the only conditions a species can tolerate. That's the simplifying assumption of species distribution models. And the more invalid that assumption is, the more misleading these forecasts based on these sorts of models will be. So we have sort of 4 propositions relevant to niches, extinction risk, and conservation. The first proposition is that the differences between the realized and fundamental niche are often large. So, and the idea here, let me step back and say what I mean by the fundamental niche and the realized niche. So the realized niche are the conditions that a species realizes. They're what it actually experiences in its native range. So that envelope of conditions is the realized niche. The fundamental niche are all the places we think it would be okay if it could get there. It's actually a bit more complicated than that, but that's kind of the idea. One other important part of it is maybe it would, part of the fundamental niche space isn't occupied because there's some sort of antagonistic interaction with another species. So we know that there can be big differences because of the examples I just gave you. So these between continent comparisons of native and naturalized ranges. But there's often large disjunctions within the native and naturalized range on the same continent. And the physical conditions of those places can be really different. So I'll give you this example. So this is a bottle brush buckeye, which you can purchase here, or at least you could a few years ago. I don't have the most current list. I assume it's still for sale. So this is the native range of the species, right? And we might think it's a climate specialist, but it's certainly not. It's grown in horticulture all over the East Coast. It has escaped into the wild in North Carolina and parts of Pennsylvania. So these climate conditions where it's living and thriving are very different than Alabama, right? So we know just from this within a continent comparison that the conditions realized here are a small subset of what it can actually handle, its fundamental niche. Second proposition is that we need to consider something different, this idea that we dreamt up for this paper we wrote. Because when, if you're an academic scientist, you get to come up with these terms, and usually they get ignored, but every once in a while they catch on. So anyway, we'll see if this one catches on in a few years or not, but it's this idea of the tolerance niche. And the tolerance niche, so the fundamental and realized niche have this idea of climate conditions that allow a species to have a sustainable population, a self-sustaining population. The idea with the tolerance niche, which should be apparent to anyone that's into horticulture, are the conditions that don't allow for a self-sustaining population, but still allow for growth. So imagine that we have a plant from Alabama that cannot set seed in New England, but can grow here. So imagine it's missing its pollinator, or the growing season's too short, something happens to keep it from being able to reproduce. Or it reproduces, but only so little that it can't maintain a population. But it grows just fine. That would be part of its tolerance niche. It's beyond the borders of the fundamental niche. So there's a few reasons we might care about the tolerance niche. And one is that it can inform species' capacity to shift their geographic distributions. So remember I gave you this example earlier. And we said that, what if it's kind of warm and then it cools down and warms up again? And we were afraid that when it cools down, even though it's marched north in some warm decades, when it cools down, it's going to die. But it's not going to die where it's marched north if it actually has a broad tolerance niche. So imagine it's responding to its ideal conditions and it's marching northwards, and a cool decade comes along, and maybe it doesn't continue reproducing in that decade, but if it holds on, then as soon as things warm back up again, it's primed to keep marching north. So if you end up having a broad tolerance niche, you're better able to deal with the sort of real world messiness and changes in climate that we actually expect. And I've done a bunch of modeling work to show that ends up being really important for some species in forecasting whether they'll be able to shift with changes in climate. Another reason we care is that the tolerance niche can inform management options. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. The third proposition is that relationships among all the components of the niche can be characterized, or at least partially characterized. And so with plants, there's evidence from the native, naturalized, and horticultural ranges. So the idea is that you can use the native range to characterize the realized niche, the naturalized range to help characterize the fundamental niche, and the horticultural range of species to help characterize the tolerance niche. So let's have a look at this buckeye. And I showed you sort of blob distributions before. This is just one based off point occurrences. So the red is still the native range. The yellow are naturalized occurrences. The blue is a small subset of the places that it's grown commercially in the eastern U.S. Okay? And what we can do then is we can look at this geographic map, and we can put that into niche space. Now, if we want to look at niche space, we might look at climate conditions. And we might look at a whole bunch of climate conditions at once and do something like a principal component analysis. But for this illustration, I'm just going to show you two axes, right? So mean annual temperature on the x-axis, mean annual precipitation on the y-axis. What I want you to see is that the red circle around the red dots is small relative to the yellow circle, and that is small relative to the blue circle. Okay? So this is meant to be the realized niche, an estimate of the fundamental niche, and an estimate of the tolerance niche. So one thing that you know, if you are interested in New England flora, is that there are many endemics to the southeastern United States that are naturalized in the northeast. And that leads to a particular type of mismatch between the realized and fundamental niche. That type of mismatch can be described as a niche syndrome. So the fourth propositions are that niche syndromes inform extinction risk and management options. And so I'm going to walk you through this, sort of the anatomy of a niche syndrome. And by niche syndrome, I mean the relative size and position of the realized fundamental and tolerance niches. So one thing we could have is a syndrome like this, a narrow breadth and tightly nested. So the red is the realized niche, and then the yellow is the fundamental niche, and it's just a tiny bit bigger, and the blue is the tolerance niche, and a tiny bit bigger still, and it has sort of a bullseye pattern, right? That's one possibility. If that is what the niche is like, and imagine the species lives in a place, like a particular national park, and imagine that beyond the boundaries of the national park is farmland or an urban setting or some sort of landscape the species can't move through. So it needs to survive in place. And imagine that with climate change, things warm up. So if that happens, the conditions the species experiences shift to the right on this curve. Okay? So let's say 100 years from now, things are warmer. It's experiencing these conditions, even though it hasn't moved, right? And if this is the situation, this species is dead. It's dead because it can't handle these conditions. It's beyond its tolerance stage. So they don't have to look like that. They could look like this, or like this, or like this, and I'll show you some more in a minute, right? We dream these shapes up, right? And the reason we dream these up is because no one's mapped any of them, right? So if they look like this, let's say they look like this one. I like this one. Well, this would be bad news for conservation, if this is what it's like. There's all this yellow space here in a warming world situation, right? So all this yellow space on the colder end, all this blue space on the colder end. We warm things up just a little bit here, it's going to shift beyond all of its niche boundaries. Look at this one. We warm things up a little bit, it shifts into its tolerance niche space. This one, this could be good news. If this is what species are like, they might warm things up and shift into their fundamental niche space. So let's do that. Let's warm things up and let's think about what it means. So in this situation, what we would want to know is why wasn't it occupying that part of its fundamental niche before? If it wasn't occupying it purely because of dispersal limitation, then this species is fine. If it wasn't occupying it because of antagonistic interactions with species, then we care about whether those species are shifting, how strong those interactions are, and that's going to affect what we think the fate of the species are and what our management options are. Like I mentioned before, the species is just at immediate risk of extinction with climate change. There's not much we can do to protect it in place, but what we could do is manage relocation if we wanted. because we have all of this space to move it into. That niche space is going to be found in a case like North America, further north of its historic distribution. This sort of situation is interesting because now the life history of the species in question really matters. Imagine it's a tree, right? Imagine it's a tree and it's shifted into its tolerance niche. Boy, it might be okay for a few hundred years. Imagine it's an annual plant and it's shifted into its tolerance niche. It's in trouble really quickly. And of course, here are a few more, right? And you know, our point is that, boy, it would be nice to know what these actually look like. So that's basically theory, and how do you go from that to data and testing hypotheses? And so the sort of proposition of our work and what we're engaged in this big research project right now is this idea that plants offer an excellent opportunity, that we can use native, naturalized, and horticultural distributions to generate hypotheses about realized fundamental and tolerance niches. And so I showed you this example before. Here's another example. I really like this one. So here is this is a mallow. It's a shrub. It's got these beautiful flowers. I'm sorry, I should have put a photo in. Because it has beautiful flowers, it's been planted in horticulture for a long time. As a native, it's only found on the Channel Islands of California. It's not historically known anywhere from the mainland. But the yellow dots are all, or yellow squares, are all places it has become naturalized on the mainland, right? Even in northern Baja California, down around Ensenada. And then the blue, it's sold way more places than this, but at the time, this is just the data I had. So, you know, once again, the red circle around the realized conditions are small, and that's because the Channel Islands have a very stable climate, because they're islands in the ocean on the west coast of the continent at this latitude. So very stable climate. It's got a larger fundamental niche and a larger still tolerance niche. But what I want you to see is that this species is thriving in places. You might not be able to see it. There's a yellow square behind that blue circle right there. It is thriving in conditions that are 5 degrees C warmer than anywhere in the native range. Right? 5 degrees Celsius warmer. And it's thriving not just in those climate conditions, but with the species interactions in those places. So, you know, when you look at this sort of narrow niche breadth, you might assume that the species is in trouble with climate change. But actually, this is a species that's probably at low risk from climate change. Here's another species. This is another mallow. This one is endemic only to a single island, a single channel island. Consequently, you know, its realized niche is tiny. Its tolerance niche is big. We don't know what its fundamental niche space is. It's only come into horticultural sale recently. It hasn't had a chance to escape into the wild. There's work in New Zealand to suggest that generally, if a species is going to escape, it usually takes about 50 years before it happens, after it's first sold in horticulture. So I'm not saying that rule of thumb will apply everywhere, but there's a time lag. But we'd love to know what the yellow space is like. And so one of the goals of really understanding these niche syndromes and understanding the different sorts of traits that plants have that might influence them would be to be able to predict what the yellow is like, to have a sense of whether this is a species that's likely to be at risk from the changes in climate per se that we expect over the next 100 years. So there's lots of limitations and opportunities with this sort of approach. One issue to consider is that the boundaries between niche components are hypotheses. Right? In all cases, additional work would be necessary to define precise boundaries. The other thing is that we can't fully characterize niche space with these approaches. So think about the exotic data, where things are naturalized. We can be sure that they can tolerate those conditions, but maybe there's other conditions they can also tolerate, but no one's planted them there, so we just don't know. So what we're getting is sort of a minimum estimate of what they can tolerate. That minimum estimate, that incomplete data, is still useful. And of course, there's thousands of species that can be studied. And so if the characteristics of these species can be related to niche syndromes, then we can build a predictive framework for understanding how species distributions relate to climate. So anyway, the data exists, and Jesse and Regan and I and others are working on this right now. Hopefully a year or two from now, I'll have lots of cool patterns to be able to show you. But anyway, we think this is an exciting line of research. So this is the final and shortest part of the talk. So hang on, I'm almost done. Considerations for the New England flora. So many species in the New England flora will not survive here without human intervention, right? If we really end up being like North Carolina in terms of climate. So deciding what to do is largely a social issue, whereas deciding how to do it is a scientific one. Right? So as a society, we are yet to engage on these issues. And we're not having conversations about this yet. I mean, some scientists are talking with their buddies and that sort of thing at conferences, and there's federal agency folks talking to state agency folks. It's happening a bit, but there's not a broad-scale discussion about it yet. So one question is, should we move species, or should we help them evolve? What about endemics on islands or mountaintops? What about globally rare species or regionally rare species? How do we prioritize what sorts of species that we want to deal with? The second issue is many species currently that are currently part of the southeast flora will shift the ranges into New England. So if a species from the southeast or the mid-Atlantic shifts into New England, should we embrace these new species? And does the answer depend on how they got here? Does the answer depend on how they're doing further south? So I'm going to give you this example. This is work mostly done by Jesse and his lab. So looking at the horticultural escape and naturalization of the umbrella magnolia, Magnolia trapetala in western Massachusetts. So the native range is shown here in green. All the green from Florida Panhandle and southern Alabama, Mississippi, right up through the Appalachians, all the way up to about the southern border of Pennsylvania. That's the best guess at the known historic distribution of this species. The red are sites where it's now naturalized in New England and New York. And this circle down here are places where the species is dropping out. Historically, these were robust populations, but the average population size here is now down to a handful of individuals with no juvenile recruitment. So presumably in another couple decades, these will all be gone. Now, the classic expectation with climate change is that species should shift north, right? So we should expect to lose populations in the south and gain them in the north. What's happening in this particular case, though, we are gaining them in the north, but they're all escapes from naturalization. I mean, they're all escapes from horticulture. We're not getting any movement through the Pennsylvania farmland and human-modified landscape. And I will tell you, let's see, these seeds, birds love these seeds. This is a bird-dispersed tree. Wouldn't you guess that bird-dispersed trees should be able to keep pace with climate change? So as we've started to get into this topic more and learn more about dispersal, some of these like oh duh kind of moments occur as you learn a bit of natural history. And the thing is that, you know, resident birds or migratory birds could move this, right? Migratory birds would have the potential to move it further. But the seeds don't ripen until September and October. And so what are the birds doing in September and October? They're going south. There is no real way for this species to naturally make big jumps. It can kind of diffuse through the landscape, but of course the landscape's heavily modified, and that makes it tough. So anyway, we've got these naturalized sites in the north. One of the interesting things is that this thing has been sold since the 1800s in New England. But there were no naturalizations until really recently. What Jesse did is went out and actually cored the largest individuals in these populations to figure out when they first got established. And showed pretty convincingly, in this case with different spots in Massachusetts, that this is all happening around the same time as things are warming up. So presumably what was going on is you had species living in New England in their tolerance niche. Climate change has been going on, and the fundamental niche has shifted north for it. So this is now part of its fundamental niche space. there's more data along those lines, and we're actually looking at the timing of the events from sort of central Pennsylvania up through New York into New England, and there's a really intriguing pattern there. But, you know, what should we do with this species? Is it native? Is it exotic? How do we think about it? I mean, don't worry, like the lawyers will eventually argue over it, and it will end up affecting what the agencies do and how it gets managed. But the thing is that science actually can't answer that question. It's not like there's a scientific answer that it is or isn't native. That's I don't know, it's going to be an interesting one to wrestle with in the years ahead. Okay, third point with the native flora. Many species in the current New England flora will survive best in Canada, right? So we've got people here that are studying things that are growing up towards the top of Mount Washington. They can't move too much further up Mount Washington, right? There's like a limited amount of space. They could do well further north someplace, and presumably some of them do, but you know, how are they going to get there? So should we help them? Should we help them with corridors? Should we do managed relocations? Will Canadians want our species? There's all those sorts of issues to wrestle with. So, okay, I told you at the beginning there'd be one more conservation strategy. So, we're calling this one unmanaged relocation. It may end up actually being the most important strategy, if you want to call it that. But according to Haynes, and we talk about this in this Belmare et al. Paper coming out in Rodora this year, New England has 374 plants, species that have been reported as being invented or naturalized, that are from other parts of the U.S. So one thing, you often hear about non-natives from other continents, but not everyone appreciates that, you know, so in Europe, if something is native to Spain and gets introduced to France, we call it a non-native species. But here, if it's native to Alabama and gets introduced to North Carolina, we might not call it a non-native species, even though the distance might be exactly the same. These political boundary ideas don't really matter to species, right? So anyway, there's a lot of within continent movements of species. So one thing that Jesse and I and Regan have been working on is characterizing the scope of the horticultural trade in the U.S. So what we're doing actually is I don't want to say randomly, we picked 800 nurseries from different parts of North America. And we took 1,000 species at random from the U.S. flora, and we asked which of those are sold at those nurseries. So this work's still in progress, but it looks like it's going to be something like 40 to 50% of the native flora of the U.S. is sold in commercial nurseries. So there's something like 16,000 vascular plants that are native to the contiguous U.S., the lower 48. That means that there's something like 6,000 to 8,000 of those species being sold commercially. All of those have the potential to escape into the wild. So that could be horrible if you're worried about invasion. It could be wonderful if you're thinking about this as a strategy, if we think about this in the context of that magnolia that's shifting north. I'm not saying it's good or it's bad, but it's going on. And I will just mention that the things I've talked about in this talk, the bottlebrush buckeye, the umbrella magnolia, lots of other plants are also right here in Gardens in the Wood, right? There's something like 20 different rhododendrons that you can buy, 20 different rhododendron species you can buy at Garden in the Woods. I don't know, like maybe 6 are native to the area. So anyway, this is a very common thing, and it's sort of a double-edged sword, but there could be some big benefits. So final thoughts and conclusions, sort of last slide. Climate change poses extinction risks. Conservation strategies offer opportunities, but also difficulties and some risks. Comparison of the native and naturalized ranges allows study of how climate relates to range boundaries. We can build a predictive framework, or we hope to build a predictive framework to better understand how species will respond to climate change. Finally, understanding how to respond to climate change and what strategies we should use is not just a scientific issue, but a societal one as well. So I'll end there. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer some questions. Yes?
interesting stuff. I had a question about the tolerance niche based off of your nursery or cultivated populations. But things that are cultivated are, you know, they're watered.
Yeah, yeah. So we're actually,
yeah.
so we're calling the nurseries and talking to the people to make sure. For instance, in the north, you worry that something might be grown in a greenhouse just because they sell it. Maybe it's not made for outside planting. For us, it's golden. If they grow it in Tucson and they have to water it to keep it alive, then we know that's outside its tolerance niche.
Right.
So it's not just that it's sold someplace. We need an additional bit of information. Yeah. But we're getting that.
Right.
Yeah. Yes.
So, apart from abiotic factors like temperature and precipitation in explaining species distribution, are there perhaps other biotic factors like pollinator abundance or soil microbes that also play a role in, you know, the way species are distributed? And
Absolutely. Yeah, and
how
so
much of that is been included in?
right, so the classic thing with the way these species distribution models have been applied over the last decade is sort of pretending like climate's the only thing that matters. But I don't know, most people that do field work know that there's lots of other things like biotic interactions that also matter. And the question is, how much do they matter at a geographic scale? And are there ways of predicting how important they are? So certainly there are species that are, you know, obligate mutualists with a particular symbiont, and so they literally can't be found in that place if that other species isn't there. There's also going to be, you know, it looks like predation is actually very important, particularly pathogens and diseases, and limiting the geographic distributions of some species. So, you know, and there's lots of classic examples of pines being introduced to certain places in the southern hemisphere and not being able to grow well until their soil symbionts were also introduced. So these things matter, and what we're trying to do is figure out when does climate give you most of the answer and when does it not? And can we predict that? Hopefully we can predict some of it. So that's the idea. Yeah. In the back?
So a lot of nursery stock is either closed stock or when it's grown from seed, it's rarely representative of the natural range. Has anyone started looking into, you know, how much of, say, a northern genotype or a southern genotype, or kind of where the you know, the original parent material is coming from and how it affects these kind of theoretical ranges of these plants?
Yeah, very, very, I mean, there hasn't been much work on that. So another simplifying assumption of these species distribution models is that all individuals in the species can handle all parts of the conditions that the species as a whole experiences, which is probably wrong for most large range species. Now, there are some ways, I mean, so the short answer is what you just asked is going to be hard to deal with. There are places like Arnold Arboretum where, you know, these incredibly precise notes have been taken, right? So like for many of their sessions. So they'll know that, you know, like Rhododendron bassii, they first collected that in North Carolina, and they know where they collected it more or less. And there are cases where you can match that to particular subspecies or varieties. So there might be some way of trying to pull that out for some species. But I think that's going to be hard to do well in the current project I'm working on. Yeah. But certainly a really important consideration. And one of the issues, I guess, related to that, which you might have been getting at, was also that, you know, there might be some hybridization or evolution that's going on in the botanical garden that also, and some strong selection that then affects how these populations do, which might be a pitfall in the sense that those populations might not accurately reflect, in some cases, what the species in the native range can tolerate. So anyway, there's this complexity there, yeah. Yes?
Two comments slash questions, or two comments I hope you'll comment on. One was from a meeting we had here a few months back ago with a lot of people in this room, some professional botanists. And Arthur Haynes, who's of course one of the most knowledgeable botanists in New England, was sort of talking about various rare species and showing distributions, and somebody finally asked him, you know, how can you explain like this particular New England distribution of the species using sort of town level or county level? And Arthur said, finally, I've given up trying to explain geographic distributions. So that's the first sort of comment on that. I mean, if somebody at Arthur's level is, and I've often felt the same way looking at the broad spectrum of the Northeast and using a lot of, you know, county level maps at the, at John Curtiz's site, the Bonap site, where you see these huge disjuncts and these oddball distributions all the time for our rare species. Things that occur mountaintops in the Upper Peninsula and mountaintops in New England and nothing in between. And
Yep.
so, can you comment on that? And then I have one more follow-up that's unrelated.
Well, okay, let's go back. So, look, I said it's in Alabama, but there's this one population over here that's native, or presumed to be native in South Carolina. And this place, when I first saw that, I thought, that's gotta be wrong, right? But then, for whatever reason, someone spent the time to go out and investigate this population, and it's got this microhabitat that is really similar to the conditions here in the core of its range. And I've forgotten the details now, but there's some reason why they think this thing would have been able to disperse there at some point in the past. So, I mean, one of the complexities we have is that these ranges form over thousands of years, in some cases millions of years, but everything that's here in New England wasn't here 20,000 years ago. Right? So like everything is shifted, and in a sense, all the species that are in New England are good dispersers, or at least okay dispersers, because they got here. And the reason that there's lots of rare endemics down here in the southern Appalachians, they're mostly all, and you know, Jesse can tell you he's working on this, mostly all south of the last glacial maximum, right? And you know, these things that are dispersed by ants, they're just lousy moving across the landscape. So I think there's a lot of stochasticity, a lot of luck. Like one thing that a guy named Chris Thomas has looked at is in England, you know, if over the last 2.5 million years, there's been all these different glacial and interglacial cycles. We're in a warm period right now. What was warm 100,000 years ago, and it was warm again roughly 100,000 years before that. And you have species that have this sort of stronghold in Spain and then make it up to England, but only make it some interglacials. So it's almost like there's this luck of the draw. And that's what makes this stuff so tricky. But I think that there's a set of species that are really good at dispersing. And those species, their ranges probably aren't as random. My guess is they're filling up all the usable space. So part of what we're trying to get a handle on is how dispersal figures into the story. One thing we're looking at right now are like the trees that we believe were megafauna dispersed. They are much more likely to have these giant naturalized distributions. But it's probably only because we're really underestimating their native distribution, you know, if we hadn't knocked off all their dispersal agents. So, I don't know, that's like a long conversation that we had over beer or something.
Yeah,
The question is can we, by looking at hundreds of species, find some rules of thumb? And I think we can, but it won't be a silver bullet, and there will be that complexity that remains.
So the other question I had was about species that are very dependent on certain disturbance regimes. I mean, all these things are sort of, you know, species that are growing largely in forests.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, we have on the Cape, of course, a lot of species of pitch pine, scrub oak that were very much dependent on fire that's been eliminated from the landscape. And you know, you can't really deal with that in this whole model and this whole way of thinking. And that, besides sort of a related, somewhat related note, is that we've had a tremendous explosion of white-tailed deer population all up and down the East Coast, and they're affecting distributions of plants probably far more than climate is right now, at least in parts of the range. So that's a whole other issue too. There may be dispersing a lot of things too.
Right. Yeah, and I guess that, you know, Yeah, it's complicated, and there's a lot of these things going on, and I think from my point of view, the thing to try to do is to find the general patterns as much as you can, but be comfortable with this idea you're not going to be able to explain it all, and try to figure out where you have some certainty and where you have lots of uncertainty. Yeah. Yes.
Someone came up with the term redundancy of function, I think it is, where you have plants occupying a certain region. And as some of them fail to adapt and they decline or go extinct, and others come in and take their place. And this theory says that the basic purpose of all of that is so that you'll have something there to grab the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and fix the nitrogen in the soil. There's a certain stability to the whole system. And I'm wondering, as we see species move from one area to another, and others decline and leave, is there some indication that there's a natural process that we're trying to maintain a certain kind of stability?
Yeah, so I mean, you've hit on one of these major questions that's just starting to emerge in the field, which is how are these ecosystems going to function? And one of the questions is, how important are co-evolved species interactions? How important is that species have a long evolutionary history together so that they can operate in a complementary way? Does that really matter? And when you start to have these novel assemblages of species, do they function as well as ones that are less novel, that have more history with each other? We don't have a good answer for that right now. And it could be that they function just equally well. It could be that they function 5% worse or 5% better. So we need to know that. We don't know that right now. But what I will say is that there are lags in things moving. We do know that species systems that become species poor are less stable. I originally got interested in ecology, besides the fact that I like critters and plants and stuff, in a biology class when I learned about this like classic example of what's called a trophic cascade with sea otters and sea urchins and kelp. The story I was told in high school, right, was that you have these kelp forests on the west coast, and the kelp grows up, if you don't know it, like, I don't know, 40 meters high in some places. And it literally forms a forest-like situation under the water, and that there's this incredible diversity of fish and invertebrates that live in that kelp forest. But the sea otters, when they're overhunted and removed, don't control the sea urchin population. The sea urchins are those spiny little ball-like creatures that are moving around on the bottom eating algae, and one thing they'll do when they get overly abundant is eat the holdfast to the kelp, the thing that keeps them holding onto the rock. And when that happens, the whole kelp forest system washes away. And I just thought that was the most fascinating story when I was in high school. This idea that you messed with this one thing, and that had this chain effect, which had this chain effect, which caused the whole system to go away. What I learned about, actually as a postdoc, working with some marine people, was that, I got like the 5-cent version of the story. That actually, historically, there had been this fish, these sheephead fish, that also controlled the sea urchin population. And there had been, what was the other one? There was another lobster. And the lobster also controlled the sea urchin population. And that the problem wasn't that you removed the sea otters. The problem was that you fished out that fish, you got rid of the lobster, and you got rid of the sea otter, and then the sea urchin population got overabundant. So that redundancy was there in the natural system. But we sequentially removed all that redundancy, and then we got trouble. And so what's really uncertain right now is how much redundancy is necessary, how quickly and what sort of lags are there going to be as species drop out of a system before new ones move in, and what sort of risks does that create. And so you've hit on this really important set of questions that the field does not have a good set of answers for you yet. So it might all be okay and it might not. Yeah. That was a long answer to say that, sorry. Yes.
So you talk a lot about
societal decisions that need to be made.
Yeah.
How do you see that playing out? Is there just going to be a increased publications and the scientists are going to get the news in the media and there's going to be a tipping point? Or how do you see this becoming part of the real discussion? Are there species that are really going to start falling out? Is it going to be too late by the time this is addressed socially?
Yeah, I don't know, and that's not my area of research. So I can just kind of give you my personal opinions on it, but they're sort of, I mean, a lot of people know about polar bears now, and are concerned about them. I think, I don't know. I think about, I was not alive in the 60s, but coming out of the 60s was this sense of environmental responsibility, and shortly thereafter the Endangered Species Act gets passed, and there was a lot of societal support for it, is my understanding. And obviously people not happy about it as well, but I think there's the capacity for these conversations to happen in diffuse ways. I don't know what the best way to do it is. I myself have tried to organize conferences where we get academic scientists together with agency people together with regular people to try to think about things, but that does not end up being a catalyst for societal conversation. I don't know. It's an important question and I wish I had the answer for you. Yeah. Maybe one more question and then my voice is gone. Yeah.
You had her hand up first.
Oh, okay.
Is that me?
Yeah.
Okay. So thinking about unplanned migrations,
Yep.
what kind of biases do you think exist in the horticultural trade?
Pretty flowers, get to live.
Yeah. So are things with
Fast
small
growing.
ranges, things that are rare?
Yeah, I think what'll be nice to do is, so we'll have this 1,000 species we picked, and we'll be able to look at the ones that are sold, and we can analyze what sorts of patterns pop out. But I think we could all kind of guess what some of those characteristics might be. But it's going to be species perceived as useful or attractive. I don't know, people probably sell a lot of trillium, right? And rhododendrons, and that's not accidental.
I might just jump in with
Okay.
one additional comment here and give your voice a break. Is that one of the big concerns of the horticultural trade is the genetic variation and the stuff they sell. It's just very little variation. And so those plants might do fine in one area, but they may not do well through the whole range.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you capture that variation when you're trying to look things over thousands of flowers.
That's a good point.
Maybe a round of applause for Dov.